3,000 years before the first stone was laid at the Colosseum, before Rome was even a village on a muddy riverbank, before the Greeks had written a single word of philosophy, a civilization living on one of the driest strips of land on the surface of this planet was doing something that would remain invisible to the rest of humanity for 2 millennia. They were drawing, not on cave walls, not on pottery, not on the flat face of a cliff. They were drawing on the earth itself, carving images into the desert floor with such scale and such precision that the finished pictures could only be seen in their entirety from several hundred meters in the air, at a time when human beings had never flown, at a time when the highest any person had ever stood was the top of a mountain or a tall tree. They were making art for an audience they could never reach. And for 3,000 years, the desert kept their secret perfectly. No rain to wash it away, no vegetation to swallow it, no civilization powerful enough to pave over it, just silence and dust, and the dark stones arranged with impossible patience into shapes that waited and waited and waited for humanity to finally look down from the sky and see what had been there all along. That moment came in the 1920s when the first pilots to fly over the Peruvian coast looked down at the desert plateau south of Lima and saw something that made no sense. Lines, hundreds of them, stretching for kilometers and perfectly straight trajectories across the flattest, most barren terrain they had ever seen. And between the lines, enormous figures. A bird with a wingspan longer than a city block, a spider drawn with anatomical accuracy across 150 meters of desert floor, a monkey with a perfectly coiled tail, mathematicians, and eventually artificial intelligence for the next 100 years. That century of investigation is now reaching a turning point. A team of researchers from Yamagata University in Japan, working in collaboration with scientists from IBM, trained an artificial intelligence model on the Nazca Desert. They fed it thousands of aerial photographs and high-resolution satellite. The Nazca Plateau sits approximately 400 kilometers south of Lima on the coastal plain of southern Peru. It is called the Pampa Colorada, the Red Plain, because its surface is covered in a layer of dark reddish-brown pebbles coated in iron oxide, baked to near permanence by thousands of years of relentless sun. Beneath that dark surface layer is a pale yellowish-white subsoil, almost luminous by comparison. By contrast, dark on top, pale beneath, is the entire physical foundation of the Nazca Lines. It is brilliantly, almost elegantly simple. To make a line, you remove the dark surface stones and pile them carefully to either side of the cleared path, unchanged by vegetation because almost nothing grows here. The environment that makes the Nazca Desert one of the most hostile places for life on Earth is precisely what has preserved the lines for 3,000 years. The desert was not their enemy. The desert was their canvas. And the people who made these drawings understood it better than almost any civilization has ever understood its environment. The Nazca civilization flourished on the southern coast of Peru, roughly between 200 BCE and 600 CE. They were not a mysterious, vanished culture. They left extensive evidence of their existence. Their pottery is some of the most vivid and technically sophisticated ceramic work, hydrological achievement that required deep scientific understanding of groundwater flow, soil permeability, and seasonal water table fluctuation. These were not primitive people. They were sophisticated, organized, and possessed of a relationship with their physical environment that bordered on the intimate. They had to be. Their survival depended on reading the desert's rhythms with absolute precision. And the lines they drew on that desert surface reflect that precision in every measurement, every angle, every carefully cleared path. The formal scientific study of the lines began in 1927 when a Peruvian archaeologist named Toribio Mejia Gespe first documented them officially. Though he initially believed they were ancient roads or irrigation channels, it was not until the 1940s, when aerial photography became more accessible, that the true character of the geoglyphs became clear. A historian named Paul Kosak flew over the region and described what he saw as the largest astronomy book in the world. His collaborator, a German mathematician and astronomer named Maria Reiche, would devote the next 5 decades of her life to the desert. She moved there. She lived there permanently. She spent years measuring. By the time satellite imagery became available in the late 20th century, the confirmed count of figurative geoglyphs on the Nazca Pampa stood at a few hundred after nearly a century of research. That number grew slowly because the work was genuinely difficult. From the ground, most geoglyphs are invisible. You are standing inside the drawing without the altitude needed to see its shape. From aerial photographs, the geoglyphs are present but subtle. Dust, lighting angle, partial erosion, and the sheer volume of imagery to process. Then the Yamagata University team changed the equation entirely. Working with IBM researchers, they trained a deep learning object detection model on existing confirmed geoglyphs. They showed the model what the cleared lines looked like in aerial and satellite imagery under various lighting conditions and at various levels of preservation. They taught it to identify the specific visual signature of a geoglyph, rather than simply matching a template. And then they set it to work on the full data set of aerial photographs and high-resolution satellite images covering the Nazca Pampa. In 6 months, the model identified 33 new geoglyphs. 33 confirmed geoglyphs in 6 months against a baseline of roughly 400 discovered through nearly a century of human effort. The study was published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, and the research community's response ranged from astonishment to immediate recognition that the age of manual survey in this region was effectively over. But even that initial result understated what was coming. By mid-2025, the team announced at Expo Osaka that the total had reached 893 confirmed geoglyphs, of which 781 had been identified through the AI-assisted analysis. Nearly 900 geoglyphs in a region that human eyes had been studying for a century. The vast majority of them invisible to every researcher who had ever walked or flown over this desert before a machine learned to look at it correctly. Among the newly discovered figures are images that researchers had not previously encountered in the Nazca record. Scenes depicting what appear to be human sacrifice. A priest figure carved into the desert floor carrying a severed head. Humanoid forms arranged in postures, suggesting ritual. Confrontation, ceremony, narrative. Figures that appear to be interacting with one another across the landscape in sequences that carry the structural quality of a story being told in installments. These are not decorative abstractions. They are scenes from a civilization's inner life, preserved in stone and earth for 2,000 years, waiting for the right eyes and the right tools to finally read them. And the AI has not merely expanded the count, it has transformed the analytical framework. When researchers could only see a few hundred geoglyphs scattered across the landscape, patterns were difficult to establish with confidence. When you can see nearly 900, patterns become impossible to ignore. What emerged from the comprehensive AI-assisted survey reshaped the fundamental theory of why the lines were made. The geoglyphs, it turns out, are not random, they are organized. And the organization reveals 2 distinct categories of purpose operating simultaneously across the same desert landscape. The large figurative geoglyphs, the ones stretching for hundreds of meters, the famous condor, the hummingbird, the spider, the monkey, cluster around the area surrounding Kawachi. Kawachi was the ceremonial center of the Nazca civilization, a vast complex of adobe platforms and plazas that served as the spiritual and political heart of the culture. The large geoglyphs surrounding it appear to have been designed for collective, community-scale use. They are built to be perceived at the scale of the sacred, as visible markers of shared belief that could orient an entire people toward a common center, that could make the relationships between the Nazca and the forces governing their world visible on a scale large enough to be unambiguous. They are communal prayers, written in the only medium that the sky could read. The smaller geoglyphs, the relief-type figures depicting humans, domesticated animals, solitary heads, intimate scenes from daily and ritual life, these cluster along the ancient trail system that crisscrosses the desert floor. They sit, on average, within 43 meters of the pathways. They are figures meant to be encountered up close by an individual walker or a small traveling group. They are personal rather than monumental. They were not built to be seen from above by divine forces. They were built for the pilgrim, for the ordinary person moving through the desert with our animals and their grief and their private supplications. They are the wayside chapels of the Nazca sacred landscape. Intimate devotional presences for the individual traveler on a long journey through an empty and overwhelming place. The structure, the grand communal figure oriented toward the divine and the intimate personal figure oriented toward the human traveler, reveals a civilization with a remarkably sophisticated spiritual geography. The desert was not simply a terrain, it was a designed sacred landscape organized to serve different scales of human spiritual experience simultaneously. The large figures addressed the cosmos on behalf of the community. The small figures accompanied and guided the individual on their personal journey. Together, they transformed the entire Pampa Colorada into something that functions as both a public cathedral and a private devotional space, built not from stone and mortar, but from millions of carefully displaced rocks across hundreds of square kilometers of desert floor. And the question of what they were asking for within this cathedral, the question that has drawn researchers back to this desert for nearly a century, has an answer that the physical and cultural evidence now supports with remarkable consistency. Water. The Nazca Desert receives an average of approximately 20 minutes of rain per year, 20 minutes across 12 months. For a civilization that depended on agriculture, on crops, on the seasonal flooding of rivers, carrying water from the Andean highlands to their coastal fields, the sky was not simply a backdrop to existence. It was the governing fact of existence. The forces that the Nazca believed controlled the sky, the beings that regulated rain and drought, that decided whether the rivers would flood this year or fail, were the most important forces it was possible to address. And the animal figures dominating the large geoglyphs are not chosen arbitrarily. Every one of them is a theological argument. The condor is a creature of the high mountains, the realm where clouds form and rain is born, and it descends to the coast, connecting the world above with the world below, the source of water with the place of need. The spider depicted in the famous Nazca spider geoglyph is not a generic spider. Researchers have identified it as a specific Amazonian species associated in Andean belief systems with rain and fertility. The hummingbird carries across multiple South American traditions the symbolic role of messenger between human and divine realms, a creature of such extraordinary speed and agility that it seems to exist between worlds rather than fully in any one of them. The monkey has no natural habitat anywhere near the Nazca coastal desert. It belongs to the lush Amazon basin, the world of water abundance, of perpetual green, of rain so reliable it becomes a kind of background noise. Its presence in the Nazca desert is an act of longing made permanent in stone. These are not decorative choices. They are the vocabulary of a sustained, multi-generational conversation with the sky, a petition drawn in the only scale large enough to ensure it would be heard. Now for the question that the AI-assisted research has finally moved from speculation to documented evidence. How were these things actually built? The answer is both simpler and more extraordinary than a century of theorizing had fully established. The physical method is confirmed. Wooden stakes driven into the desert floor at key structural points of each design. Rope stretched between the stakes to define the guidelines along which workers would then clear the dark surface stones. Archaeological surveys have found actual wooden stakes still embedded in the desert floor at the termination points of numerous lines. These stakes have been carbon dated, and the dates are consistent with the known occupation period of the Nazca civilization. They are not theoretical. They are physical objects that Nazca hands drove into this ground 2,000 years ago, still standing in the same positions, preserved by the same dry stability that preserved the lines themselves. For the large animal and figurative geoglyphs, the organic shapes with curves and proportional relationships that needed to remain accurate across enormous distances, researchers now believe with high confidence that the Nazca worked from scaled drawings. A figure drawn on a small piece of cloth or on a prepared flat surface divided into a grid could be transferred to the desert floor by scaling each grid square proportionally, section by section, the way a modern muralist transfers a small sketch to the face of a building. This technique is ancient, practical, and effective. Modern experiments conducted by researchers attempting to replicate Nazca geoglyphs using only the tools available to the Nazca civilization have demonstrated that a small team can reproduce the proportions of a complex animal figure with accuracy that matches the originals. No elevation, no aerial observation during construction, no technology beyond a scaled drawing, a grid, wooden stakes, and rope. The precision of the lines is the product of method, patience, and organizational capacity, not of mystery. For the straight lines, the ones running for kilometers across variable terrain without deviation, the method is even more straightforward and in some ways even more impressive in its implications. You drive a stake into the ground. You stretch a rope in the intended direction. You drive another stake at the rope's far end. You extend the rope further and repeat. When terrain rises or falls, the rope angle is adjusted to maintain the sightline, and the cleared path follows it faithfully. Modern surveyors testing this technique on similar terrain have achieved deviations of less than 1 meter over a kilometer-long line using nothing more sophisticated than stakes and rope. The lines are straight, not because of alien guidance or we're building. To sustain collective motivation for labor that offered no immediate practical return, no harvest, no shelter, no trade good, only the belief that the work itself was the most important thing a community could do. The Nazca had no writing system as far as current evidence demonstrates. They had no wheeled vehicles. Their largest draft animal was the llama. They had no iron tools. And yet, periodically re-cleared and refreshed across centuries, suggests something quite different. It suggests a living practice, a communal devotion that successive generations inherited and renewed, a relationship with the sacred landscape that was understood not as the achievement of ancestors to be preserved, but as an ongoing responsibility to be continued. The desert was their collective memory, and they returned to it generation after generation to keep that memory alive and active and visible to the forces they needed most. The newly discovered geoglyphs have added hundreds of previously unknown chapters to this living memory. Among the most significant findings emerging from the AI analysis is the narrative quality of the smaller geoglyphs distributed along the ancient trail network. Sequences of figures positioned along pilgrimage routes in ways that suggest they were meant to be encountered in order, that a person walking the trail would meet figure after figure, image after image, in a progression that carried the structure of a story unfolding across the landscape. This reading remains interpretive. Much in Nazca research necessarily involves inference from limited evidence, but it is inference grounded in physical data, in the measured distances, Between figures, in their orientations relative to the trail, in the thematic relationships between the images in each sequence. The AI made this pattern visible by revealing the full distribution of figures across the landscape. When researchers could see only a fraction of the geoglyphs, the trail-based narrative sequences were impossible to identify. With nearly 900 geoglyphs mapped and their positions precisely documented, the pattern emerges with a clarity that no researcher had previously been in a position to observe. The technology deserves a clear-eyed moment of appreciation because it is easy either to overstate or to understate what it has accomplished. The object detection model trained by the Yamagata University and IBM team did not understand anything about the Nazca people. It did not interpret meaning or establish cultural context or make the judgment calls that require human knowledge of ancient Andean civilization. What it did was remove the perceptual bottleneck from the discovery process. It looked at every image in the dataset with the same attention and the same criteria, without fatigue, without the distorting effects of prior expectation, without the bad days and tired afternoons that affect any human researcher working on a massive and repetitive visual task. It made the discovery process scalable in a way it had never been before. And that scalability has implications that extend far beyond Nazca. There are ancient landscapes on every inhabited continent, Saharan geoglyphs, Amazonian earthworks, Arabian desert kites, Australian stone arrangements, vast landscape features in Central Asia, visible from satellite, but never systematically surveyed. Every one of them represents a potential equivalent of the Nazca situation, centuries of incomplete knowledge waiting for the right analytical tools to reveal the full picture. What happened in Peru is a proof of concept for a new relationship between artificial intelligence and archaeological discovery, one in which the machine's capacity for consistent, tireless pattern recognition amplifies the human researcher's capacity for interpretation and understanding in ways that neither could achieve independently. The count of 893 geoglyphs is not the final number. The AI analysis has not yet been applied to every potentially relevant region surrounding the known pampa. New satellite imaging technologies produce imagery at resolutions that would have seemed extraordinary only a decade ago. LiDAR, a laser-based scanning technology capable of detecting subtle variations in ground elevation beneath dust and surface debris, has begun to be applied to the Nazca region and is revealing subsurface features that neither human eyes nor standard cameras had ever detected. The desert has more to say. Researchers are confident of that. Every new figure the machine finds is a new sentence in a conversation that began 3,000 years ago and is only now becoming fully legible. When you sit with all of this long enough, the facts and the method and the scale and the devotion embedded in those millions of carefully displaced rocks, what moves you is not the mystery of how. The how is largely settled. Wooden stakes, rope, scaled drawings, organized labor, patient precision, and a desert that preserved the results with extraordinary fidelity across 2,000 years. What moves you is the why. A people living in a desert so hostile to life that it receives 20 minutes of rain in an average year, drawing pictures of water-bearing creatures on the ground, because they believed that making their need visible at a scale large enough for the sky to read was the most powerful thing they could do. They built the equivalent of a cathedral, not from stone, but from the desert floor itself. They lit no candles. They sang no preserved songs. But they drew their prayers in the only medium available to them at the scale required by the magnitude of what they needed. And they kept drawing them for centuries, generation after generation, refreshing the lines, adding new figures, walking the pilgrimage trails between the images with their petitions and their hope and their collective dread of another year without water. That continuity, that multi-generational act of sustained devotion to a landscape, made sacred by the labor and belief of ancestors, is something that no scientific finding diminishes. If anything, the AI's revelation of the full scope of the geoglyph complex makes it larger and more moving than it was when we could only see a fraction of it. 900 prayers written in stone across hundreds of square kilometers of desert, addressed to a sky that offered no guarantee of answer, maintained for 5 centuries by a people who had decided that the asking itself was worth everything they had. The Nazca civilization declined around 600 CE. Researchers believe a prolonged drought, a sustained failure of the very rains the lines had been built to petition, combined with regional political instability, brought the culture to an end in a historical irony almost too painful to contemplate. The desert remained. The lines remained. The piled stones on either side of every cleared path remained exactly where Nazca hands had placed them. And they waited through 14 centuries of silence, through the rise and fall of the Inca Empire, through the Spanish conquest, through the birth of the modern state of Peru, through the invention of flight and the development of satellite imaging and the construction of artificial intelligence systems in universities and technology companies on the other side of the world, they waited for a team in Japan to teach a machine to look at their desert correctly. And now we are here, not at the end of the story. At the beginning, the AI has not solved the Nazca Lines. It has revealed that the puzzle was always much larger than we had imagined, that the desert was never a gallery of a few famous figures, but an entire civilization's sacred infrastructure, a spiritual geography of almost incomprehensible scale and deliberateness, written across the face of the earth in the language of devotion. 893 geoglyphs, and the desert is still counting. Every new figure the machine finds is another voice from a people who are still, impossibly, after 3,000 years, speaking. And every researcher who walks into that heat to verify a discovery, crouching in the same dust under the same indifferent sky where Nazca workers once cleared stones with their bare hands, is completing a circuit across the full span of human time. The lines are still there, the conversation is still open, and we are only now, finally, beginning to hear everything that was said.